Aldermere Park had always been a house that announced itself. Even from the far end of the valley, its pale stone caught whatever light the sky was willing to spare, and on fine days the windows burned gold like a row of watching eyes. It was a house that expected to be noticed. It was a house that expected its master. Leofric Hale, 7th Duke of Aldermere, had been away for 4 months. London, the season, the usual procession of obligations and indulgences that his title demanded and his temperament endured. He had left in April when the parkland was beginning to soften into green and the lake was shaking off its winter gray. He returned in August, a week later than he had planned, with a conscience he refused to examine and a vague, formless expectation that everything at home would be precisely as he had left it. The first sign that it was not came at the gate lodge. Old Brennan, the gatekeeper, stood to attention, as he always did, but his eyes slid away from the carriage window. He did not smile. He did not offer his customary observation about the weather or the state of the road. He simply opened the gate and stepped back into the shadow of the lodge as if he wished to disappear into the stone itself. The drive was almost a mile long, lined with ancient oaks whose branches formed a cathedral of green above the gravel. Leofric watched the house grow larger through the carriage window and tried to name what felt different. The lawns were trimmed, the gravel was raked, the roses in the south border were in full, abundant bloom. Everything was in its proper place, and yet something was missing from the picture. Some vital warmth that he could sense the absence of without being able to identify its source. The carriage stopped at the front entrance. No one came out to meet him. He sat for a moment, one hand resting on the carriage door, a crease forming between his brows. Then he stepped down onto the gravel and climbed the stone steps alone. The great hall was dim and cool. 2 footmen stood at their posts near the staircase. They bowed. Their faces were composed, correct, and entirely empty. He handed his coat and gloves to the nearer of the 2 and looked around. The flowers on the hall table were fresh. The mirrors gleamed. The marble floor was spotless. He could find no fault with any of it, and yet the silence of the house pressed against him like a breath being held. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked. He addressed the question to no one in particular. It fell into the stillness and lay there like a stone dropped into deep water. The 2 footmen exchanged a glance so brief it was barely a movement at all. The older one, a man named Holt who had served the family for 15 years, cleared his throat. "Her Grace is not in residence, Your Grace." Leofric turned to look at him. "Not in residence." The phrase was polite, institutional, carefully drained of any real meaning. It could mean she was visiting a neighbor. It could mean she was at the dower house or in the village or at her sister's home in Warwickshire. "Where has she gone?" "I could not say, Your Grace." He waited for more. None came. Holt's gaze was fixed on the wall behind Leofric's left shoulder with a stillness that was not deference. It was something closer to judgment. Leofric climbed the staircase. His boot struck the stone with a sound that echoed through the empty space above him. He turned down the east corridor past the morning room, past the long gallery of ancestral portraits, to the suite of rooms that had belonged to the Duchess since the first week of their marriage. He opened the door. The room was immaculate. The bed was dressed with crisp white linen, its coverlet smooth and untouched. The curtains were drawn back to admit the pale afternoon light. The writing desk was bare. The dressing table was empty. No hairbrush, no perfume bottle, no book left open with a ribbon holding her place. He opened the wardrobe. Nothing. Not a gown, not a shawl, not a single pair of silk gloves. The drawers were lined with lavender paper and held nothing but air. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, his mind refusing to assemble the evidence into the only conclusion it could support. She was gone. Not visiting, not traveling, not away for the afternoon. Gone. Her belongings removed, her presence erased as cleanly and completely as if she had never occupied the room at all. Even her departure had been orderly. Even in leaving, she had caused no disruption. She had simply ceased to be there. He found the letter on the mantelpiece. It was written on her own stationery, the pale blue paper she had always favored, her handwriting as controlled and precise as her voice. It was brief. He read it, standing by the cold fireplace with the afternoon light falling across his shoulder. My lord, I have left Aldermere. This is not a decision taken in haste or in anger. I have considered it with great care, and I have concluded that my continued presence in this house serves neither your happiness nor my own. I take nothing that is not mine by right. I ask nothing of you. I wish you every good fortune, and I will not return. Saren. He read it twice, then a third time. Each reading stripped away a layer of something he had not known he possessed. There was no accusation in the letter. No mention of London, no mention of the name he had hoped she would never hear. No reproach, no demand for explanation. It was the letter of a woman who had weighed her life against a standard only she could measure and had found it wanting. It was the most dignified piece of writing he had ever held in his hands, and it destroyed him. He folded the letter and placed it inside his coat against his chest. He descended to the library and rang for Holt. When the footman appeared, Leofric spoke with a steadiness he did not feel. How long has the Duchess been gone? 5 weeks, your grace. 5 weeks. She had been gone for 5 weeks, and no one had sent word to London. No letter, no urgent message, no rider dispatched to his townhouse. He searched Holt's face and understood. They had known. Every member of the household, from the cook to the boot boy, had known she was leaving and known why, and they had chosen silence. A collective, deliberate silence that was its own verdict. Where did she go? Her grace did not disclose her destination. Your grace. She departed in a hired carriage from the village. She was accompanied by no one. Leofric dismissed him with a nod. He sat alone in the library for a long time. The letter lay against his chest like a small, persistent accusation. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the house upon him. The cook who had prepared Saran's favorite dishes without being asked. The gardener who had planted the roses she loved along the south wall. The maids who had pressed her clothes and changed her linen and watched her move through the house with her careful grace. They all knew. They knew why she had gone, even though the letter did not say it. His disgrace was not private. It was a common fact, whispered behind closed doors, and confirmed by the empty wardrobe, the bare dressing table, the immaculate room that no longer held the faintest trace of the woman who had lived there. He was the Duke of Aldermere, master of 4,000 acres, a house of 50 rooms, and a name that stretched back to the conquest. And his wife had walked out of all of it without a backward glance, and not a single soul in his household had thought him worth informing. That night he dined alone. The dining room, built to seat 30, swallowed him in its silence. The candles flickered on empty chairs. The footmen moved around him like shadows, pouring wine he did not taste, removing plates he had barely touched. He retired early, but he did not sleep. He lay in his room staring at the ceiling and listening to the house. It breathed differently without her. He had not known until that moment that he had ever noticed how it breathed at all. 3 months later, and 40 miles to the north, in a village so small it did not appear on most maps, a woman called Nell Calder was carrying water from the well. Dornsby sat in a fold of the moors, a huddle of stone cottages arranged around a single muddy lane that served as both its main street and its marketplace. It had a church with a lopsided spire, an inn that smelled permanently of damp wool and wood smoke, and a schoolroom attached to the vicarage where the children of local farmers and shepherds gathered to learn their letters from whoever could be persuaded to teach them. For the last 3 months that person had been Nell. She was a slight, fine-boned woman with dark hair pinned beneath a plain linen cap, and gray-green eyes that held a guarded, watchful quality. She dressed simply in a gown of brown wool and a worn shawl. She spoke softly, smiled rarely, and kept to herself. The village knew her as a widow from the south, who had come north for her health. She had taken a room in the cottage of an elderly widow named Mrs. Gretton, and had made herself useful. She helped with the teaching. She tended the small herb garden behind the vicarage. She assisted the village women with their mending and their letters. She asked nothing of anyone, and offered whatever she could. She was liked well enough, but not truly known. She wore her privacy like a second skin, and the people of Thornsby, who understood solitude as only those who live on open moorland can, respected it. But there was one soul in Thornsby who had pierced the careful armor that Nell wore so well. Her name was Effa. Effa Bowen was 7 years old. She had black hair, fierce, dark eyes, and she had not spoken a single word in over a year. Her mother had died of fever the previous winter, and something in the child had sealed itself shut with the closing of the coffin lid. Her father, a tenant farmer on the edge of the moor, was a decent man who loved his daughter, but had no idea how to reach her. The village women clucked and fretted over the child. The vicar prayed for her. The older children either pitied or avoided her. Nell had done none of these things. On her second day in Thornsby, she had found Effa sitting alone on the churchyard wall, her small boots dangling above the wet grass, her face as closed and shuttered as a locked house. Nell had not spoken to her. She had not crouched down with a bright false smile and asked the child how she was feeling. She had simply sat down on the wall beside her, a respectful distance apart, and looked out at the same gray horizon the child was staring at. They had sat together in silence for the better part of an hour. Then Nell had risen, given the girl a small nod, and walked away. The next day, Effa had appeared at the schoolroom door. She did not come inside. She stood on the threshold, watching, her dark eyes tracking Nell's movements as the woman guided the other children through their reading. Nell looked up, saw her, and said nothing. She simply left the door open. By the end of the first week, Effa was sitting in the back of the schoolroom. She did not participate. She did not read aloud or scratch her letters on the slate. But she was there, and the fact of her presence was its own small miracle. By the end of the first month, Effa was walking beside Nell to the well each morning, carrying a pail that was far too large for her small frame, her silence no longer hostile, but companionable. The village noticed. They called it strange, even uncanny. Mrs. Gretton said the child had simply found another soul that understood stillness, and clung to it the way cold hands cling to a warm cup. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said about either of them. What the village did not know, what no one in Thornsby could have guessed, was that the woman they called Nell Calder was Saren Hale, Duchess of Aldermere. She had been married for 3 years. The marriage had been arranged in the way such things were always arranged, among their class, a joining of property and name, brokered by fathers who valued acreage above affection. Leofric had been courteous on their wedding day, and distant by the end of their first week. He was not cruel. He was never cruel. He was simply absent, even when he sat across from her at the dinner table. His mind lived in the estate ledgers, in the business of land and tenants and yield. She was a fixture in his house, a function of his title, and in 3 years of marriage he had never once asked her what she was thinking. She had tried. In the early months she had made attempts, small, careful overtures that a more attentive man might have recognized as a woman reaching across the distance between them. She had asked about his work. She had offered opinions on the management of the tenants, opinions that were well informed because she had quietly educated herself in the running of the estate. She had reorganized the household accounts, improved the stillroom, established a small fund for the tenants' children to attend the parish school. She had visited the tenant farms every fortnight, carrying baskets of food and tinctures from the stillroom to the families who needed them most. She knew the name of every child on every holding. She knew which roofs leaked and which wells ran dry in summer. A stout, plain-spoken farmer's wife named Bridget Ennis on the western boundary had become something close to a friend. 2 women bound not by station, but by the unspoken understanding of those who know what it means to endure without complaint. He had noticed none of it, Or if he had never mentioned it. She existed in the margins of his life, visible only when required for a public function or a formal dinner. And then London. The season. He had gone as he always did, and this time he had not come back on time. The letters had thinned to nothing. And then the whispers had reached Aldermere, carried by a visiting cousin, confirmed by a servant who had accompanied the Duke to town. There was a woman. A young woman named Ottilie Sorrel, beautiful, vivacious, everything that Saren in her steady restraint was not. Saren had absorbed the news the way she absorbed all things, silently, without visible reaction. She had continued to run the house. She had continued to visit the tenants. She had continued to sit alone at the long dining table and eat her meals without complaint. But in those final weeks, something else had surfaced. Something far more dangerous than a husband's betrayal. The estate steward, a man named Haddon Carvel, had served Aldermere for nearly a decade. He was a tall, angular man with a quick mind and a manner so smooth it bordered on the theatrical. Leofric trusted him completely. The Duke had handed Carvel near total authority over the finances of the estate, the rents, the expenditures, the wages, the contracts for timber and grain. It was this trust that Saren had begun to question. It had started with a small thing, a discrepancy in the household accounts, a figure for candles and lamp oil that was nearly double what she knew the house consumed. She had mentioned it to Carvel in passing, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, she had received a smile, thin and cold, and a suggestion that the Duchess should perhaps confine her attention to matters within her competence. That smile had awakened something in her. She had begun to look more carefully, methodically, in the hours when the house was asleep. She had compared the household records she kept against the estate ledgers that Carvel controlled. The numbers did not match. Rents that should have flowed into the estate accounts were smaller than they should have been. Payments to suppliers she had never heard of appeared with regularity. Sums were diverted to accounts she could not trace. She had written to Leofric in London. The letter had never reached him. She discovered later that Carvel had intercepted it. She had tried a second time, addressing it to the Duke's solicitor. That letter too had vanished. And then Carvel had come to her. He had found her alone in the morning room one evening, and he had closed the door behind him. His manner had been polite, even gentle, and it was the most frightening conversation of her life. He had told her that he was aware of her enquiries. He had told her that such enquiries, if pursued, would be deeply embarrassing for the Duke, whose own signature appeared on many of the documents in question. He had told her that a wife who made wild accusations against a trusted steward, particularly a wife whose husband had publicly chosen the company of another woman, would find herself in a very precarious position. He had not used the word. He had not needed to. The implication hung between them like a blade. A wife declared unfit. A removal from the world, dressed up as medical concern. Then he had smiled again, wished her a pleasant evening, and left the room. Saren had sat motionless for a long time after the door closed. The fear she felt was not the hot, rushing kind. It was cold and precise, and it clarified everything. She understood now. The relationship was not incidental. Ottilie Sorrel was Carvel's cousin. She had been placed in Leofric's path deliberately, a beautiful distraction designed to keep the Duke in London, blind and occupied, while Carvel continued to bleed the estate dry. And Saren, the wife who noticed too much, who asked the wrong questions, who kept her own careful records, had become the one obstacle that remained. She could not fight from inside the walls of Aldermere. Not alone, not without allies, not without proof that could withstand the word of a man the Duke trusted above all others. She needed time, she needed safety, and she needed the one thing Carvel had made sure. She could not obtain from within the house the original estate ledgers. So she had planned her departure with the same meticulous care she had applied to everything in her married life. She had gathered what documents she could, copies of her own household records, the letters she had drafted to Leofric that had never been sent. She had taken only what belonged to her. She had written the letter to her husband, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it had no bottom, and she had left, before dawn, on a Tuesday morning, alone, in a hired carriage, while the house slept, and the man who was stealing her husband's fortune dreamed peacefully in his quarters above the stable block. She had not run away. She had retreated to fight from ground of her own choosing. And for 3 months, in the small windswept village of Thornsby, with a silent child at her side and a secret burning in her chest, Saren Hale had waited, and watched, and planned. Back at Aldermere, the days after Saren's departure stretched into weeks, and the weeks calcified into a silence that Leofric could not outpace no matter how hard he worked. He threw himself into the estate. He rode the boundaries. He inspected fences. He met with tenant farmers and listened to their grievances with a patience that surprised them and exhausted him. He told himself that he was doing what a duke ought to do, that the land was what mattered, that the house and its rhythms would adjust to the absence of one woman, but the house did not adjust. It resisted. He began to notice things, small things at first, the kinds of details that accumulate so gradually they become invisible until the hand that tended them is gone. The stillroom, once stocked with tinctures and salves that the tenants relied upon, had fallen into disarray. The linen cupboards, which had always been ordered with a precision he had assumed was the natural state of linen cupboards, were now chaotic. The weekly basket of food and medicine that had been delivered to the poorest families on the estate had ceased entirely. He asked a housemaid about it and received a blank look. That was the Duchess's arrangement, Your Grace. She managed it herself. He found her records in the morning room, not hidden, not locked away, simply sitting in the drawer of her writing desk where they had always been, waiting for someone to look. They were meticulous. Every expenditure, every receipt, every entry cross-referenced and annotated in her neat, careful hand. There were household accounts going back to the first month of their marriage, and alongside them a separate set of notes. Well, observations really. Precise, methodical observations about the running of the estate that no one had asked her to make and no one had known she was making. A payment to Garside & Sons for fencing materials. No corresponding fence work observed on the South holdings. Timber contract with Moorcroft and Hale. Hale is not a known timber merchant in the county. Possible connection to Stewart's family. Rent collection from Bracken Farm. Tenant reports paying £14 quarterly. Estate ledger records £11. Discrepancy of £3 per quarter. There were dozens of entries like this, page after page. And beneath them, in a separate folder, a schedule of fortnightly visits to every tenant farm on the estate, each entry noting the family's needs, the condition of their buildings, the health of their children. She had been the thread that connected the great house to the lives it was supposed to sustain. And he had been in London, consumed by distractions of his own making, ignoring the letters that had never arrived. He sat at her desk for a long time, turning the pages, and felt something shift beneath the floor of his understanding. He had thought of Saren as a dutiful, reserved woman who occupied his house, and asked little of him. He had mistaken her silence for emptiness. He had mistaken her restraint for a lack of depth. What he held in his hands was evidence of a mind as sharp and methodical as any solicitor's, and a loyalty to the estate and its people that put his own to shame. He closed the ledger and looked around the morning room. She had sat here every evening. He could picture her now, the lamplight on her dark hair, her pen moving in those deliberate, unhurried strokes. She had been right here, doing work that mattered, trying to protect the home he was supposed to be protecting, and he had walked past this door 1,000 times without once stopping to ask what she was doing. That evening, he summoned Haddon Carvel to the library. The steward arrived promptly, as always. He was a man who understood the theater of competence, the firm handshake, the direct gaze, the leather case of documents carried under one arm, and he stood before the Duke's desk with the easy confidence of someone who believes himself essential, Leofric studied him. He had known Carvel for almost 10 years. The man had been recommended by a business associate in London, and his management of the estate had seemed, on the surface, exemplary. Rents were collected, repairs were scheduled, reports were delivered on time and in good order. But Saren's notes sat in the drawer of the desk between them, and the numbers she had recorded did not match the numbers in Carvel's ledgers. "I have been reviewing the household accounts," Leofric said. He kept his voice neutral, conversational. "There appear to be some irregularities in the supply expenditures, candles and lamp oil in particular." Carvel's expression did not change, not a flicker. "Prices have risen considerably this year, Your Grace. The war on the continent has disrupted several supply chains. I can provide a detailed breakdown if you wish." It was a smooth answer, delivered without hesitation. The kind of answer designed to make the question feel foolish. "Please do," Leofric said. "And while you are at it, I should like to review the full estate ledgers for the past 2 years. I have been neglecting my oversight, and it is time I took a closer interest." Something moved behind Carvel's eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, like a fish turning beneath the surface of a still pond. But Leofric caught it. He had spent his life reading the faces of men across negotiating tables, and what he saw in that fraction of a second was not surprise or even annoyance. It was fear. "Of course, Your Grace. I shall have them prepared for you by the end of the week. Tomorrow," Leofric said. Carvel paused. The silence lasted one beat too long. "Tomorrow, Your Grace. As you wish." He bowed and left the room. Leofric sat listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor and felt the shape of a terrible possibility begin to form in the darkness of his mind. He thought of Saren's letter. "I take nothing that is not mine by right. I ask nothing of you." She had not accused Carvel. She had not mentioned the discrepancies or the intercepted letters. She had simply left, and now he understood why. She had known that her word, the word of a wife whose husband had publicly abandoned her for another woman, would carry no weight against the trusted steward of a duke. She had been alone in this house with this man and his lies, and there had been no one to believe her. The ledgers arrived the following morning. 2 large bound volumes, carried to the library by Carvel himself with a smile that was all surface and no warmth. Leofric opened them and began to read. By midday, he knew. He could not yet prove it. The numbers were clever, the diversions subtle, the false accounts dressed in enough legitimate detail to withstand a casual inspection. But a casual inspection was not what he was giving them. He was reading them with Saren's notes beside him, her observations acting as a map through the labyrinth of Carvel's deception. And everywhere her map pointed, he found the same thing. Money leaving the estate through channels that led nowhere he could trace. Rents that shrank between the tenant's hand and the estate's coffers. Contracts with suppliers who seemed to exist only on paper. The scale of it was staggering. Thousands of pounds, siphoned away over years under the nose of a duke who had been too busy, too distracted, too arrogant to look. And then another discovery, one that turned his blood to ice. He found a record of quarterly payments to a name he recognized, Sorrel, Audley Sorrel, £200 per quarter, listed under the heading of Estate Consultancy. There it was, laid bare in Carvel's own handwriting, the connection. The woman who had captivated him in London, the beautiful, bright, irresistible Audley, was not a chance encounter at a society ball. She was an expense. She was a line item in a ledger of theft. She had been placed in his path like a jeweled trap, and he had walked into it with his eyes wide open and his wife's heart in his careless hands. He closed the ledger. He sat in the library in absolute stillness while the clock on the mantelpiece marked out the seconds of his disgrace. He thought of Saren's face on their wedding day, serious and hopeful, and young. He thought of the careful fund she had established for the tenant's children. He thought of her sitting alone in this house, discovering what he was too blind to see, trying to warn him, being silenced, being threatened. And he thought of the letter. "I have considered it with great care. and I have concluded that my continued presence in this house serves neither your happiness nor my own." She had not left because of Ottilie. She had left because the house itself had become a cage, and the man who was supposed to be her partner had handed the key to her jailer. 3 days later, the Dowager Duchess arrived at Aldermere. Leofric's mother, Katrina Hale, was a woman of 72 who moved through the world with the concentrated force of a cannonball wrapped in silk. She was small and straight-backed, with white hair worn in an old-fashioned coil and pale blue eyes that could strip the varnish off a lie at 30 paces. She had retreated to the dower house after Leofric's father died, and she preferred her garden, her terrier, and her correspondence to the drafty formality of the main house. She came to Aldermere only when she felt it was in danger. She found Leofric in the library. The ledgers were spread across his desk. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, because he had not. She did not greet him. She walked to the chair opposite his desk, sat down, and fixed him with a gaze that he had been unable to meet since the age of 12. "I see that your wife has finally left you," she said. "I am only surprised it took her this long." "You know," he said, "everyone knows. Leofric, did you imagine that a duke's indiscretion is a private matter? The woman was seen on your arm at 3 public events. Your wife received a letter from her own cousin, describing the whole sordid spectacle. That letter, at least, was not intercepted." He flinched. It was the first time in years his mother had seen him react to anything. "And what is all this?" she said, gesturing to the papers spread across his desk, a sudden passion for bookkeeping. He told her. He told her everything. Saren's notes, the discrepancies, Carvel, the payments to Ottilie Sorrel, the intercepted letters. His mother listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her expression growing colder and more focused with every sentence. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her voice was not angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. "You handed this estate to a thief because it was easier than managing it yourself. You handed your wife to a predator because it was easier than being a husband. And now you sit here in this library with your ledgers and your guilt, and you expect me to tell you what to do." "I do not expect anything," he said. "Good. Because what I am going to tell you, you will not enjoy hearing." She stood up and walked to the window. "Saren is the finest thing that ever happened to this family. She walked into this cold, loveless house, and she tried to make it better. She improved your tenants' lives. She kept your accounts honest. She saw the rot that was eating your fortune, and she tried to warn you, and you were too busy chasing a pretty face that was bought and paid for with your own stolen money." She turned back to face him. "And the most unforgivable part, Leofric, the very heart of it, is that she did not leave because you broke her heart. She left because she realized you did not have one to break. She left because she concluded that she was alone, that there was no one in this house who would stand beside her, and she was right." The words landed like blows. He absorbed them in silence. "What would you have me do?" he said at last. His voice was barely audible. "I would have you find her," his mother said. "Not to drag her back, not to perform some grand gesture of repentance that serves your pride more than her dignity. I would have you find her, because she has the evidence you need to destroy Carvel, and because she deserves to know that at least one person in this wretched family finally opened his eyes." She picked up her gloves from the table. "But first you must ask yourself a question, and you must answer it honestly, which I suspect will be a novel experience for you. Do you want to find her because you need what she knows, or because you have finally understood what you lost?" She left the room without waiting for his answer. Leofric sat alone in the library as the light failed and the shadows deepened around him. His mother's question hung in the silence like a blade. He turned it over in his mind, testing it against the wreckage of his conscience. The honest answer, the real answer, was that he did not know. He did not know if what he felt was love or guilt, or the particular agony of a proud man confronted with proof of his own blindness. He did not know if he deserved to find her. He was not certain he even knew who she was, this woman he had married and ignored and lost. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. She was out there somewhere, alone, carrying a burden that should have been shared. And somewhere in this house, a man who had threatened her, who had stolen from his family and placed a woman in his path to keep him occupied, was still sleeping soundly in his quarters above the stable block, still confident that his secrets were safe. Leofric stood up. He could not undo what he had done. He could not unwrite the months in London, the letters that were never sent, the silence that had driven the best person he had ever known out of his life. But he could do this. He could find her. He could listen. And he could burn Haddon Carvel's world to the ground. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He found her through the one person Carvel could not have anticipated. Not through a hired investigator. Not through solicitors, or agents, or the network of titled acquaintances who would have gossiped about a missing duchess over their port and cigars. He found her through a tenant farmer's wife named Bridget Ennis. He had not planned it. He had gone through Saren's records in the morning room one more time, looking for anything that might point to where she had gone. And there, in the folder of fortnightly visits, he had found Bridget's name appearing more frequently than any other. Where the other tenant entries were brief, a line or two noting the family's needs, the entries for Bridget Ennis were longer, warmer. There were notes about Bridget's youngest son and his lungs. There were notes about the state of the western fences and the quality of the Ennis hay crop, and at the bottom of the most recent entry in Saren's hand, a single line that stopped him cold. Bridget is the only one who asks how I am. Bridget Ennis was a stout, plain-spoken woman who rented 40 acres on the western edge of the Aldermere estate. She had buried 2 children before their first birthdays and raised 4 more with hands that never stopped moving. She had no patience for titles, no interest in gossip, and no particular regard for the Duke of Aldermere, whom she considered a decent enough landlord, but an absent one. She had, however, held the Duchess in something close to reverence. Leofric had not known this. He had not known that Saren visited the Ennis farm every fortnight. He had not known that she had arranged for a doctor from the town to examine Bridget's youngest, who had a weakness in his lungs. He had not known that the 2 women, so utterly different in station, had formed something that could only be called a friendship, built on the solid ground of mutual respect and the unspoken understanding of women who endure without asking for recognition. He went to the Ennis farm on a gray October morning, his horse picking its way along the rutted lane that led to the stone cottage. Bridget was in the yard, wringing out washing. She saw the Duke dismount and watched him approach with an expression that contained no deference at all. "Mrs. Ennis," he said, "I am looking for my wife." "I know what you are looking for," she said. She did not curtsy. She did not stop wringing. Her hands twisted the cloth with a slow, deliberate force. The question is whether she wants to be found. He had expected resistance. He had not expected it to cut so cleanly. "I need to speak with her," he said. "It concerns the safety of the estate. It concerns her safety." Bridget looked at him for a long time. She had the kind of gaze that did not slide across surfaces, but pressed into them, testing for weakness. "Her safety," she repeated. "You are worried about her safety. The woman lived under the same roof as that snake Carvel for months, and you never once thought to worry about her safety. But now that she has taken herself out of danger, now you are concerned." Leofric stood in the mud of the farmyard and took it. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He understood by now that explanation was just another form of excuse, and excuses were a currency that had lost all value. "You are right," he said simply. "I failed her. I am not here to pretend otherwise. But Carvel is still in my house, and the proof I need to remove him is incomplete without what she knows. If he suspects she kept records, if he learns where she is, she will not be safe. Not from the law, Mrs. Ennis. From him." Something shifted in the woman's face. Not softness exactly. but a recalibration. She set down the washing and dried her hands on her apron. "There is a village called Thornsby," she said, "on the moors, north of Hexworth." She went there because no one would think to look for a duchess on the moors. "Is calling herself Nell Calder. She is teaching children to read." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a warning as heavy as a stone. "If you go there and you bring her more grief, your grace, I will not forgive you. And neither will God." He rode north the following day. He left before dawn, telling no one where he was going. He took only what he could carry in his saddlebags and dressed in plain clothes, a dark coat and riding boots, nothing that would announce his rank to the villages he passed through. He had considered sending a letter ahead, but had rejected the idea instantly. A letter could be intercepted, a letter could be refused, and a letter could not look her in the eye. The journey took 2 days. The roads narrowed as he moved further from the lowlands, the hedgerows giving way to dry stone walls, and then to nothing but open moor, vast and rolling and colored in shades of purple and brown that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. The sky was enormous. The wind was constant. It was a landscape that tolerated no pretension, and by the time he reached the outskirts of Thornsby, he felt as stripped and exposed as the land itself. The village was smaller than he had imagined, a cluster of gray stone buildings huddled against the moor as if seeking warmth from one another. Smoke rose from chimneys, a few sheep grazed on the common, a dog barked somewhere. It was the kind of place where a stranger on a good horse would be noticed immediately, and he was. He tied his horse at the inn and went inside. The innkeeper, a wiry man with suspicious eyes, looked him over. "I am looking for a woman named Nell Calder," Leofric said. "I understand she teaches at the school." The innkeeper's expression hardened. "And who might be asking? A friend. Mrs. Calder does not have friends who ride horses like that," the innkeeper said, nodding towards the window where Leofric's bay gelding stood, its quality unmistakable even to an untrained eye. "She has friends who carry water and mend fences. You are something else." Leofric almost smiled. Seren had chosen her refuge well. She had found a place where people looked after one another and regarded outsiders with the wariness they deserved. "My name is not important," he said. "I mean her no harm. I have come a long way to speak with her, and I will wait for as long as it takes." The innkeeper studied him for another long moment, then jerked his head towards the window. "The school lets out at 4. She walks the Bowen girl home afterwards, up the track towards Bracken Ridge. You will find her on the path if you care to stand in the wind." He cared. He stood on the path above the village as the afternoon light began to soften, the wind pulling at his coat, and watched the door of the vicarage schoolroom. Unquote. The children emerged in 2s and 3s, small figures scattering across the village like seeds thrown from a hand, and then she appeared. She was thinner than he remembered. Her face, always delicately drawn, had acquired a sharpness that spoke of too little food and too much worry. She wore a brown gown he had never seen before, plain and well-mended. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath a linen cap. She looked nothing like a duchess. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a village widow, a woman of modest means and steady habits. But her bearing had not changed. She still moved with that particular grace, that economy of motion that had always made her seem as if she were gliding rather than walking. And beside her, holding her hand with the fierce possessiveness of a child who has found the one thing in the world she trusts, was a small girl with black hair and dark eyes who stared straight ahead at the path and did not speak. They were halfway up the track when Seren saw him. She stopped. Her hand tightened on the child's. From 30 yards away, he could see her entire body go rigid, every muscle bracing against something she had spent 3 months preparing herself to face. He did not move. He did not call out. He simply stood on the path and let her look at him. He understood in that moment, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the next step had to be hers. He had forfeited the right to close the distance between them. The child tugged at her hand, looking up at her with questioning eyes. Saren looked down at the girl and something passed between them, a communication that required no words. She knelt, said something close to the child's ear, and the girl turned and ran back down the track towards the village, her small boots clattering on the stones. Then Saren straightened, lifted her chin, and walked towards him. She stopped 6 feet away. The wind pressed her shawl against her body and pulled strands of dark hair across her face. Her gray-green eyes were steady and cool, and they held nothing he could read. No anger, no relief, no fear. She had composed herself as carefully as she composed everything, and the wall she had built was immaculate. "How did you find me?" she said. It was not a greeting. It was not even really a question. It was the opening move in a conversation she intended to control. "Bridget Ennis," he said. A flicker crossed her face. Not betrayal. Something closer to resignation, as if she had always known that the one person she had trusted would also be the one person who would tell. "You should not have come," she said. "I know." "Then why did you—" He had rehearsed this moment 100 times during the ride north. He had prepared speeches, explanations, declarations. He had composed and discarded a dozen different versions of the truth, each one more polished and persuasive than the last. But standing before her in the wind, with the moor at his back and the weight of everything he had done pressing down on his shoulders, every prepared word crumbled to dust. "Because you were right," he said. "About Carvel. About all of it. I found your notes. I have seen the ledgers. And I was too late and too blind and too proud to see what was in front of me." She said nothing. The wind filled the silence between them. "And Ottilie Sorrel," he continued, forcing the name out like a splinter from beneath a fingernail. "She was his, Carvel's cousin. He placed her. He paid her. With my own money." He let the full humiliation of it sit in the open air. "I was a fool, Saren. Not just a disloyal husband. A fool who was played for exactly what he was." Still, she did not speak. Her eyes searched his face, and he had the sensation of being read like one of the documents in his own library. Every line scrutinized for authenticity, every word tested against the evidence. "You found my notes," she said at last. "Yes, and you believe them. I have verified every discrepancy you identified. There are more. The total is in the thousands. He has been stealing from the estate for years." A faint tremor passed through her, so slight that only someone watching as closely as he was would have noticed. It was not fear. It was vindication, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a truth that no one else would hold. "I tried to tell you," she said. Her voice did not break. It did not waver, but beneath its steadiness there was a depth of weariness that made his chest ache. "I wrote to you twice. He intercepted the letters, and when he discovered I was keeping records, he threatened me." "I know," Leofric said. The 2 words were wholly inadequate, and he knew it. He did not try to make them larger than they were. "You know," she repeated. She let the word hang between them. "You know now, 3 months later. After I left your house with nothing but a bag and a hired carriage, and went to live in a village where I carry my own water and teach farmers' children their letters, because there was nowhere else I could go where he could not reach me. You know now." "Yes. And what do you want from me, Leofric?" It was the first time she had used his name. Not his title, not the formal address of a wife to a duke, but his name, spoken with a directness that stripped away every layer of rank and custom between them. It was the most intimate thing she had ever said to him, and it was also the most devastating. "I want nothing I deserve," he said. "I have no right to ask you for anything. But I am asking. I need the copies you made, the letters you drafted, your testimony. Without them, Carvel will survive this. He will destroy the originals and build a new story, and I will not be able to touch him." He paused. The next words cost him more than he thought words could cost. "I am asking you to save my estate, the estate I failed to protect, because I was too busy failing you." She looked at him for a long time. The light was changing, the sun dropping towards the ridge, painting the moor in shades of amber and deep gold. The wind had softened. Somewhere below them in the village, a church bell rang the hour, its sound carried upward on the cooling air. "I will think about it," she said. Then she turned and walked back down the track towards Thornsby, and he watched her go, and he did not follow. He took a room at the inn. The innkeeper gave him the worst room, a narrow space under the eaves, with a mattress that smelled of straw and a window that let in the wind. Leofric did not complain. He lay on the bed in his clothes and stared at the low ceiling and listened to the sounds of a village settling into its evening, the closing of doors, the lowing of cattle, the distant laughter of children being called inside. He did not sleep. The next morning he rose at dawn and walked to the vicarage. He did not go inside. He sat on the low stone wall of the churchyard, in the exact spot where, though he did not know it, Saren had first sat beside the silent child. He waited. She came at 8, walking up the lane with her basket of school books. She saw him and stopped for the briefest moment. Then she continued walking, passed him without a word, and entered the schoolroom. The door closed behind her. He waited. An hour passed. 2. The village moved around him, curious but cautious. The vicar came out and offered him tea, which he accepted. A farmer's wife brought him a piece of bread and cheese, which he ate. The innkeeper watched from across the lane with folded arms. A collie came and lay at his feet for a while, then wandered away. At noon, the schoolroom door opened, and Saren stood in the doorway. She held a leather folder in her hands. She crossed the lane and stood before him. She did not sit. She held the folder against her chest the way one holds something precious, something that has cost a great deal to create, and even more to keep safe. "These are my copies," she said. "Every discrepancy I found, every false account, every payment to a supplier that does not exist. The 2 letters I wrote to you that he intercepted, I kept drafts. And this." She opened the folder and took out a single sheet of paper. It was a receipt, signed in Carvel's hand, for a payment of £200 to Miss Audalie Sorrel, described as consulting services for estate management. "He left this on his desk one evening," she said. "I do not think he knew I saw it. Or perhaps he did and he wanted me to understand exactly how powerless I was." Leofric took the folder from her hands. It was heavier than he expected. The weight of it, the sheer volume of evidence she had gathered alone, in secret, under the hostile gaze of the man who was robbing them both, was a testament to a courage he could barely comprehend. "Why did you not take these to a magistrate yourself?" he asked. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something behind the composure, a flash of the old pain, the old futility. "Because I am a wife," she said. A wife who left her husband's house, a wife whose husband was publicly keeping company with another woman. Who would believe me? Leofric, a hysterical woman, scorned and bitter, making wild accusations against a respected man of business. Carvel told me as much himself. He did not need to threaten me with violence. The law itself was threat enough. The truth of it settled over him like a cold rain. She was right. In the eyes of the world, in the eyes of every magistrate and solicitor and judge in the country, she was a wife who had abandoned her home. Her testimony would be questioned, her motives would be impugned, and Carvel would stand before the court with the Duke's own signature on his fraudulent documents and the sympathetic narrative of a loyal steward maligned by a jealous woman. "But your testimony alongside mine," he said. She nodded slowly. "Together it stands. Apart it falls. That is why I said I would think about it. Not because I doubt the evidence, because I need to know that you will not fail me again." The words were not cruel. They were not delivered with malice or with the satisfaction of a woman who has gained the upper hand. They were spoken with the honesty of someone who has learned, through bitter experience, that trust is not a gift. It is a structure that must be built and tested before it can bear weight. I cannot promise you that, he said. I can only promise you that I understand the cost of the alternative. She studied his face. Then she sat down on the wall beside him, a careful distance apart, and looked out at the moor. It was the same gesture she had made with Effa on her second day in the village, a sharing of space without demand, an invitation to exist alongside without intrusion. They sat in silence for a long time. "Tell me about the child," he said at last. "Effa. She has not spoken since her mother died. She follows me everywhere." A faint, involuntary smile crossed Saren's face, the first he had seen, and it transformed her. For a moment, beneath the wariness and the caution, he saw the woman she had been on their wedding day, the woman she might have become if he had been a different kind of man. "She reminds me of myself," Saren said, "of what it feels like to have no voice and no one to hear it if you did." He felt the blade of that and did not flinch. The following morning, Leofric rode south with a folder of evidence in his saddlebag and a weight on his conscience that no distance could lighten. Saren remained in Thornsby. She had agreed to return to Aldemir for the formal accounting, but not yet. Not until Carvel had been confronted and removed. She would not set foot in that house while the man who had threatened her still drew breath beneath its roof. He arrived at Aldemir 2 days later, dusty and exhausted, and went directly to the library. He did not wash. He did not eat. He spread Saren's documents across the desk alongside the estate ledgers and began the work of cross-referencing every entry, every false payment, every phantom supplier. The candles burned down to their sockets. He replaced them and kept working. The clock struck midnight, then 1, then 2. He barely heard it. The evidence was damning in its precision. Saren had not simply noted discrepancies. She had annotated them, dated them, tracked patterns of escalation. She had done the work of a forensic accountant, with nothing but a pen and a candle, and the desperate clarity of a woman who knew that no one would help her unless the proof was beyond dispute. By morning he had assembled a case so comprehensive that no magistrate in England could dismiss it. He sent for his solicitor in London. The man arrived 3 days later, listened to the Duke's account, examined the evidence, and turned pale. "This is systematic fraud on an extraordinary scale, Your Grace. Mr. Carvel could face transportation. Possibly worse." "Good," Leofric said. "But there is something I require before we involve the magistrate." He told the solicitor what he wanted. The man raised his eyebrows but did not argue. When the Duke of Aldemir gave an instruction in that particular tone, argument was not an option. In the days that followed, Carvel continued his duties with the outward calm of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had spent nearly a decade building his position, ingratiating himself into every financial mechanism of the estate, and he had survived the Duchess's departure, the Duke's return, even the request for the ledgers. He had weathered scrutiny before. He was confident he would weather it again. He did not know that the ground had already been cut from beneath his feet. He did not know about the folder. 2 days later, on a cold November morning, Leofric summoned Haddon Carvel to the library. The steward entered with his usual confident stride, his leather case under his arm, his expression composed and pleasant. He stopped when he saw the desk. The surface was covered with papers. 2 sets of ledgers lay open side by side. And behind the desk, the Duke sat with a stillness that was not calm. It was the stillness of something coiled. "Sit down, Carvel," Leofric said. The steward sat. His eyes moved across the papers, and Leofric watched the precise moment when recognition struck. He saw the color drain from the man's face in a slow, sickening tide. He saw the composure crack. "You will notice," Leofric said, his voice low and level, "that there are 2 sets of accounts on this desk. One is yours, the other was compiled by my wife." The word landed like a hammer blow. Wife. Not the absent Duchess, Not the woman who had fled, but his wife, spoken with a weight and a possessiveness that Carvel had clearly not anticipated. The steward's throat moved. He swallowed once. "Your Grace, I can explain." "You cannot," Leofric said. "There is no explanation for what is on this desk. There is only the truth, and the truth is that you have stolen from my family for the better part of a decade. You have falsified accounts. You have invented suppliers. You have diverted rents. You have paid your own cousin £200 a quarter to keep me distracted in London, so that I would be too occupied to notice what you were doing in my house." He picked up the receipt that Saren had found, the one signed in Carvel's own hand. "You left this on your desk," he said. "My wife found it. She kept a copy. She kept copies of everything, every discrepancy, every forged entry, every lie. You threatened her into silence, but you could not threaten her into stupidity." Carvel's composure had collapsed entirely. His face was gray. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were trembling. "She had no right," he began. Leofric stood up. The motion was slow and deliberate, and it silenced the room. "She had every right," he said, and his voice was no longer contained. It carried the full, resonant authority of a man who has finally understood the weight of his own title. She was the Duchess of Aldermere. She was the mistress of this house. She was doing what I should have done, what I was too blind and too negligent and too faithless to do. She was protecting this estate and its people from you." He came around the desk and stood over the seated man. Carvel shrank back in the chair. "But the theft is not what will keep me awake at night," Leofric said. His voice had dropped again, lower now, harder. "What will keep me awake is what you did to her. You took a woman who was alone in this house, whose husband had abandoned her, and you used that abandonment as a weapon. You told her no one would believe her. You told her she was powerless. You made her afraid in her own home." He leaned forward, his hands resting on the arms of Carvel's chair, his face inches from the steward's. "And you were right. No one did believe her. I did not believe her, because I was not here to be told. But I am here now." The door to the library opened. Carvel turned and saw two men enter. One was the Duke's solicitor. The other was a magistrate from the county town, a man whose reputation for thoroughness was matched only by his contempt for corruption. Behind them in the doorway stood the Dowager Duchess, her pale eyes fixed on Carvel with an expression of pure, undiluted disdain. "Mr. Carvel," the magistrate said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and the misappropriation of estate funds. You will come with me." Carvel looked from the magistrate to the solicitor to the Dowager. Then he looked at Leofric. "She will never forgive you," he said. It was the last desperate lash of a man who had no weapons left but cruelty. You know that. Whatever you do now, whatever grand gesture you make, she will never forget what you did. You chose another woman over her. You can punish me all you like. That will not change." Leofric looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. "You are probably right," he said. "But that is between my wife and me. It is no longer any concern of yours." The magistrate led Carvel from the room. The steward's footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing fainter, until the front door opened and closed, and there was silence. Katrina came into the room and stood beside her son. "Well," she said, "that is done. Now the harder part." Leofric looked at her. "She is in a village called Thornsby," he said. "She is teaching children to read. She is happy, or something close to it. She has a child who follows her, a girl who lost her mother and has not spoken in a year." His mother watched his face with those pale, searching eyes. "And you want to bring her home?" "I want to ask her to come home," he said. "There is a difference." Katrina nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "there is. I am glad you have finally learned it." He wrote to Saren that evening. He did not write a long letter. He did not fill it with promises or apologies or declarations. He wrote 3 lines. "Carvel is gone. The evidence is with the magistrate. Your home is your own again, if you want it." He signed it with his name, not his title, not his rank, just his name. The letter reached Thornsby 4 days later. Saren read it, standing by the window of her small room in Mrs. Gretton's cottage, with the gray November light falling across the page. She read it once, and then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest, and she stood there for a very long time, looking out at the moor. Effa found her like that an hour later. The child came into the room without knocking, as she always did, and stood beside her, looking up with those dark, questioning eyes. Saren knelt and took the girl's hands in hers. "I have to go somewhere," she said softly, "but I will come back for you. I promise." Effa stared at her. Her small face was tight, with the particular terror of a child who has heard those words before and learned that they are not always true. Her lips moved. No sound came out. Saren pulled her close and held her. "I promise," she whispered again, "and I keep my promises. You know that." She felt the child's small body tremble against hers, and she held her tighter. And she made the promise again in the silence of her own heart, where the truest promises are kept. She arrived at Aldermere on a Tuesday afternoon. She came in a hired carriage, as she had left with a single bag and the leather folder that was now empty of everything except the drafts of the letters she had written to a husband who had never received them. The drive was the same, the oaks arching overhead, the house growing larger in the window, but everything else was different. The door opened before the carriage had fully stopped. Holt was there, and behind him the cook, and behind her 2 housemaids, and behind them the bootboy who had polished her shoes every morning for 3 years, and who was now crying openly without embarrassment or shame. They lined the entrance hall, not in the rigid formation of a formal reception, but in the loose, spontaneous arrangement of people who are simply glad, people who had missed someone and wanted her to know it. Saren stepped inside and stopped. She looked at their faces, at the tears and the smiles and the raw, unguarded relief, and for a moment her composure wavered. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Then she lowered it, straightened her shoulders, and walked through them, touching a hand here, nodding there, acknowledging each face with the attention she had always given to the people who kept this house alive. Leofric was not in the entrance hall. He was in the library. She found him standing by the window, his back to the room, one hand resting on the frame. But when he turned to face her, she saw that he was not the same man she had left. He was thinner. His face, always angular and austere, had acquired new lines around the eyes and mouth. His dark hair was longer than he usually kept it, as if grooming had become an afterthought. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were not guarded. They were not distant. They were open, in a way she had never seen before. And what they held was not confidence or authority, or the assurance of a man who owned everything he surveyed. They held fear. He was afraid. Afraid of her. Afraid of this moment. Afraid of the possibility that she had come back only to collect her things and leave again forever. "Hello, Saren," he said. His voice was rough. "Hello, Leofric." They stood on opposite sides of the library, 10 feet and 3 years of silence between them. "The staff wept," she said. "Yes. They missed me. They did." He paused. They were not alone. She looked at him steadily. She did not help him. She did not reach across the distance with a kind word or a softening of her expression. She let him stand in the difficulty of it. "I read your letters," he said. "The drafts you kept. The ones Carvel intercepted." She said nothing. "You tried to tell me what was happening," he continued, his voice strained. "You tried to warn me, and I was not here to be warned. And when he threatened you, when he used my absence and my behavior as a weapon against you, you did not collapse. You did not plead. You gathered evidence. You made copies. You built a case that a professional investigator could not have bettered. And then you walked out of this house with your dignity intact, and you disappeared." He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer guarded, No longer the face of a duke addressing a duchess. It was the face of a man who has finally understood something that he should have understood years ago. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he said, "and I do not deserve your forgiveness. I am not asking for it. I am asking only that you know that I see you now. I see who you are. I see what you did. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who saved my family, my estate, and my honor, while I was busy destroying all three." The silence that followed was the longest of her life and of his. Then Saren crossed the room. She did not rush. She walked with the same grace she had always possessed. She stopped in front of him and looked up into his face. "Do not make promises you cannot keep," she said. "I have had enough of those to last a lifetime." "Then let me make only one," he said, "and let me keep it every day so you can see that it is real." "What promise?" "That you will never be invisible in this house again." She did not look away. She did not hide it. She let him see, for the first time, the full depth of everything she had carried, the loneliness, the fear, the grief of loving someone who did not know she existed. And she let him see something else, a small, cautious, almost unwilling flicker of hope. "That is a good place to start," she said. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. His fingers closed around hers, and neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke, and the library was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the sound of the wind in the oaks outside. And for the first time in 3 years, the house felt like a house that had someone in it worth coming home to. The following spring, a carriage arrived at Aldermere that was considerably less grand than those the estate usually received. It was small, mud-splattered, and driven by a farmer from the moors who looked profoundly out of place on the manicured gravel drive. But the passenger who climbed out was treated with a ceremony that would have baffled any outside observer. Effa Bowen stood on the gravel, her small bag clutched in both hands, her dark eyes enormous as she stared up at the pale stone facade of a house larger than anything she had ever imagined. She was clean and neatly dressed in a new blue pinafore, and her black hair had been brushed until it shone. She did not speak. She had not spoken in 14 months. Saren was down the steps before the driver had set the brake. She knelt on the gravel, heedless of her gown, and opened her arms. Aoife dropped her bag and ran into them with a force that nearly knocked Serene backward. She buried her face in Saren's shoulder and clung to her with the desperate, shaking grip of a child who has crossed an ocean of fear to reach the one person she trusts. "I told you I would come back for you," Saren whispered, her voice thick. "And I did." Effa had been invited to Aldermere at Saren's request and with her father's blessing. Thomas Bowen had ridden down from the moor the week before to see the house for himself. He was a weathered, inarticulate man who stood in the great hall of Aldermere, turning his cap in his hands and looking as though the walls might close in on him at any moment. But he had watched the Duchess kneel on the flagstones and speak to him as an equal, explaining her plan with a gentleness that asked for nothing but his trust. Effa would live at the estate, be educated by Saren herself, and visit her father whenever she wished. He would see her at every market day, every holiday, every Sunday after church. She would not be taken from him. She would simply be given more. Tomas had looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then at this woman who had sat beside his silent daughter on a churchyard wall and waited without a single word until the child chose to trust her. He had wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded once. "You brought her back," he had said, his voice rough. "Not her words. Her. Whatever that girl was before her mother died, you brought it back. I have no right to keep that from her." The arrangement had been Leofric's idea. He had listened to Saren describe the child one evening in the library, the silent girl who followed her like a shadow, who communicated in glances and gestures, who had found in a stranger's presence the only safety she knew. He had listened, and he had recognized something. "She sounds like you," he had said. Saren had looked at him. In the months since her return, a new language had developed between them. It was built not on the formal exchanges of their early marriage, but on the small, honest observations that two people can only share when they have stopped performing and started seeing. She is, Saren had said, she is exactly like me. She needs someone to sit beside her and wait, not someone to fix her. Then bring her here, Leofric had said. This house has too many empty rooms and not enough life in it. The household adapted to Effa's presence with a warmth that surprised no one who understood what the staff felt for the Duchess. The cook made the child her own small loaf of bread each morning. The gardener showed her the names of the flowers. Holt, the old footman, carved her a set of wooden animals that she arranged and rearranged on her windowsill with fierce concentration. And Leofric, the cold, severe, impossibly formal Duke of Aldermere, sat beside her one evening in the drawing room and read aloud from a book of fairy tales, his deep voice filling the room, and did not stop reading until the child had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her small hand resting on his sleeve. Saren watched from the doorway and felt something crack open inside her that she had thought was permanently sealed. This was the man he could have been. This was the man he was becoming. The marriage did not repair itself in a single moment. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic scene of forgiveness. There was instead a slow, patient rebuilding, brick by careful brick. He asked her opinion on estate matters and listened when she gave it. She told him when he was wrong, and he did not bristle. They argued about the management of the South Meadow, and she won. And he conceded with a grace that made her laugh, and the sound of her laughter in the library stopped him mid-sentence and made him stare at her as if he had never heard music before. He did not touch her unless she reached for him first. He did not assume her presence was permanent. He treated every day she remained at Aldermere as a gift that could be withdrawn, and this was perhaps the truest change in him. He had learned that love is not a possession. It is a choice that must be made again each morning. On a warm evening in late May, they walked together by the lake. The parkland was vivid with new growth. The oaks were heavy with green. The roses along the south wall, the ones she had planted in her first year, were in full bloom. Aoife walked ahead of them, picking wildflowers with the absorbed seriousness of a child who was learning to be happy. The Carvel case will go to trial next month, Leofric said. The solicitors are confident. Good, Saren said. And Ottilie Sorrel has left England. My solicitor received word last week. She has gone to the continent. Saren was silent for a moment. She did not enjoy hearing the name, and Leofric knew it, and he did not pretend otherwise. I will not ask you to forgive that, he said. I will not insult you by pretending it did not matter. She looked at him. It mattered less than you think, she said. What mattered was that you did not see me. The rest was a symptom. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The evening light was golden on the water, and the air smelled of cut grass and roses. I see you now, he said. I know, she said. That is why I came back. They stood together by the lake, not touching, not needing to. Two people who had come through the worst of themselves and found, on the other side, something that was not perfect and was not effortless, and was not the love they had been promised in the stories they had read as children. It was better than that. It was real. It had been tested and broken and rebuilt, and it was stronger for the breaking. Ahead of them, Aoife stopped at the water's edge. She crouched down and watched the light play across the surface. Then she turned and looked back at them, and on her face was something that neither of them had seen before. She was smiling, and then she spoke. It was a single word, small and rough-edged from more than a year of silence, pushed out into the warm evening air like a bird released from a cage. Saren. Saren's hand flew to her mouth. Leofric went very still. The child looked at them with her dark, fierce eyes, and the word hung in the air between the three of them, fragile and miraculous and new. Saren walked forward, then ran, and swept the girl into her arms and held her so tightly that the wildflowers crushed between them released their scent into the evening. Leofric watched them. The woman who had saved his house and the child who had found her voice. He watched them and felt the last wall inside him fall, the one he had built when he was young and afraid, and had decided that duty was safer than love. He walked forward and put his arms around them both. Aoife's small hand reached up and grabbed his collar, and Seren leaned into him, and the three of them stood at the edge of the lake in the golden light, while the house watched from the hill above, its windows catching the last of the sun, no longer a monument to silence but a home. Finally, imperfectly and irreversibly, a home.